Okay. So we are going to focus on the cardiovascular system anatomy, which is basically going to be your heart. We have discussed the blood vessels last time when we were doing the arteries and veins and the arterioles and venules, etc. And if you guys recall, which is something that we want to make sure we understand for this lab as well, is when we talk about arteries, arteries are going to be the one that are taking blood away from our heart, regardless of if it's oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. And then when we're talking about veins in general, veins are the one that are returning blood back toward the heart. So I kind of told you like A for away, right? And then V for returning back to the heart. That's kind of an easy way of remembering the order. In terms of the blood that is circulating, if you're unfamiliar with the vocabulary I have been using, just to kind of put your mind at that kind of mentality, anytime I use the word oxygen poor or deoxygenated, that basically means the level of oxygen are low and the level of carbon dioxide, which is our waste gas, is high. And this type of blood is typically depicted as blue color. It's not really blue, it's just the darker red color, which appears to be blue. And then when we're talking about oxygen rich or oxygenated blood, that's basically the blood that is going to be really packed with a lot of oxygen and very little carbon dioxide. And this blood is going to be ruby red. So if you basically see this blood, and if you cut a blood vessels that carrying the oxygenated blood, the blood looks really super red. It has a shine and gloss to it. Versus when we're looking at the oxygenated blood, it would be kind of a dull color, darker color red, which is again appear blue under our skin. So as I mentioned today, we're going to look at the heart anatomy. Now, one of the first things we want to talk about when we talk about heart anatomy is the concept that your heart is actually has two separate circulation. It is a continuous circulation for both, but it is technically two separate circulation. One of these circulation or circuits is referred to as the pulmonary circuit. If you guys are unfamiliar with the word pulmonary, pulmonary simply means your lungs. So if you're talking about pulmonary circuit, this is the circuit that basically starts from the heart, goes to your lungs, and then comes back toward your heart. So that's a circle, right? Anytime you think about circle, cycle, or circuit, it has to be starting from one point and then coming back to the same point. So pulmonary circuit is going to, again, start from your heart, go to your lungs, and then come back to your heart. Systemic circulation, the word systemic basically talks about the systems of your body. So like your digestive system, your urinary system, your nervous system, etc. So basically this system is going to take the blood from your heart, send it to all of the system of your bodies, all of your body tissues, all of your cells, and then take that blood and return it back toward the heart again. So if you notice, for both of these circuits, again, pulmonary or systemic circuits or circulations, we're starting with the heart, going somewhere, and then returning that blood back toward the heart. Now, before we go farther than that, I have a question for you guys. So if I ask you the question, for pulmonary circuit, do you think the blood that is going toward your lungs, the blood that is going toward your lungs, is it oxygenated or deoxygenated? What would you say? Blood going to your lung, is it oxygenated or deoxygenated? Can't be both unless you're a baby. Or a fetus, I should say. It is, okay, I'm getting mixed answers. So think about it. Give me 1 second. Let me explain this to you. What is the purpose of your lungs? To bring in what? Let me ask you that. What's the purpose of your lungs? Okay, what type of air? Oxygen, more specifically, is bringing oxygen. So if I'm taking blood to my lungs, would that blood have a lot of oxygen or little oxygen in it? Little oxygen. So when you're using little, what is the proper word? Oxygenated or deoxygenated? Deoxygenated. Good job, guys. So hopefully that makes sense. So think about it logically, guys. If I'm taking blood to my lungs and my lungs is very rich in oxygen, then there is no need for me to take a blood that is already oxygenated to my lungs. So what is the goal for the pulmonary circuit? Pay attention to this. Pulmonary circuit takes a blood that is deoxygenated, take it to the lungs, and what it does in the lungs, there's a gas exchange. The gas that is getting rid of CO2, which is your bad gas, and it's picking up the oxygen. So when you're looking at that type of blood, okay, the blood that is going to your lungs, what color would it appear to be, blue or red? The blood that is going to your lungs is going to be blue. By the time it's coming out of your lungs and coming back toward your heart, what color would it be? Red, correct. Is this making sense to everybody? So the goal of having a pulmonary circuit, guys, let's make sure this is clear. The goal of having a pulmonary circuit is to take the oxygenated blood, do a gas exchange in your lungs, and change that deoxygenated blood to an oxygenated blood. Now, here, reverse that concept for the systemic circulation. What does my system, what does my cells, what does my tissues need? Oxygen or carbon dioxide? They need oxygen, right? So the blood, so pay attention to this. So the blood that is going from the heart to my tissue, is it oxygenated or deoxygenated? It's oxygenated, correct. Now, what happens in my tissue is that your tissue is going to pick up the oxygen from your bloodstream and it's going to give it CO2. So the blood that comes off of your tissue and is going back toward your heart, what type of blood is it? The blood that is coming off of your tissue and going back toward your heart, what kind of blood is it? Okay, not the color, but the type of blood. Is it oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood? After it has left the tissue, guys. It's deoxygenated, correct, because your body says, I'm gonna take the oxygen, right? And I'm gonna give it CO2. So what you're left with is, okay, what you're left with is a deoxygenated blood that is circulating back toward your heart again. Sorry, my other computer just decided to reboot itself. I don't know. So look at the color, guys. This is basically what I'm trying to tell you here. What you see up here is your pulmonary circuit, right? And what you see on the bottom is your systemic circuit, right? So look at the color, guys. The blood that is coming off of your heart originally, it's blue, which is deoxygenated. It goes to your lungs. See the color change, goes from blue to red, which means you're going from deoxygenated to oxygenated blood. It goes to your heart. And then from your heart, you pump that blood through the systemic circulation, which is oxygenated blood. It goes all over your body. And look at the color change again. You dropping off the oxygen and you picking up the carbon dioxide. So your blood leaving the tissue and going back toward your heart is now blue or deoxygenated blood. Does that make sense so far? Any question, clarification on anything? This is really important, guys, for you guys to connect that point right now, because we're going to build up on this concept. Good. Okay. So tell me what you notice about the heart here, guys. When you're looking at this heart, do you notice that your heart is divided by this separation right here? And one side of the heart is always blue and one side of the heart is always red, correct? Everybody sees that pattern? Okay. So in a healthy heart, guys, your heart, your anatomical positioning, oops, sorry. The right side of your heart, always carries deoxygenated blood, hence the blue color. The left side of your heart always carries oxygenated blood, which is depicted in red color. Never changes. So get that right now. The right side of the heart, anatomically, not the right side when you are thinking about it. Anatomical position on the right side of the heart is always deoxygenated blood. And the left-hand side of the heart is always oxygenated blood. That is never going to change unless we're talking about fetal circulation, which is not the case here. We're talking about an adult circulation. So we're going to build up on this, and then again, going into what are the little cavities inside the heart, what blood vessel actually comes into each of these cavities, what are the valves that are associated with the heart, and that's basically majority of our lecture for the rest of the class today. Now, one of the first thing I want to start with before we even go into the chambers of the heart and the blood vessels and the valves is what are the layers that are going to be protecting the heart? And then what are the layers that the heart itself is made up of? So please pay attention to this, guys. This is the exam questions that typically students get wrong. So focus on the two sets of words, phrases that I'm using. The layers that are protecting or covering the heart versus the layers of the heart itself. Okay? So when I'm talking about the layers that are covering the heart, so protection, they're around the heart. They're not part of the heart itself, but they're protecting the heart. We're talking about pericardium. Remember the word peri means what? Anybody remember what the word peri means? From a few weeks ago, we learned about it. Around the heart, correct. So literally is on already, not on top is epi. So pericardium is around the heart because the word cardi implies your heart. So pericardium means around your heart. So the outermost layer, the one that is actually just encasing the heart, it's kind of like a very secure, thick layer that basically tells your heart you can't go beyond this space, okay? That is referred to as the fibrous pericardium. It's a really dense, a strong connective tissue, okay? So it's literally, the job is to say, this is the limit of your heart. You cannot go beyond this. I'm gonna protect you, and that's it, okay? It's very thick, very strong. So when somebody is basically, if you were actually doing a cadaver dissection, you actually need to use a scalpel to cut through this layer to actually visualize the heart. It's a very thick layer. It's kind of almost a whitish color, and you can actually see the heart when you open up the cadaver until you break through the fibrous pericardium, okay? So it's a very thick layer. The second layer that is covering the heart, so now we're moving inward, okay? So the outer layer is the fibrous pericardium. One going inside, closer to the heart, is the layer which is called the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. So remember, serous pericardium is the double layer that surrounds the heart. So parietal layer of the serous pericardium is the second layer that covers the heart, okay? So I'm gonna type this in the chat box so you guys have the question that I'm asking you, so you have that information so you can't confuse it. So what are the layers that surround the heart? And your answer are fibrous pericardium, one, and the second layer would be the parietal layer of, not layer, layer of serous pericardium, okay? So make sure you guys are understanding this again. These are the layers that are surrounding the heart. Now, the other question that I ask you is, what are the layers of the heart itself? So what is your heart? What are the three layers that the heart itself is made up of, okay? So the first layer coming from outside inward, guys. So from outside to inside are as follows. The outermost layer is going to be the visceral pericardium. Sorry, I should say visceral layer of serous pericardium. And I'm typing this so you guys can see it in just a second. Second layer is myocardium, which I'm going to show you in just a second. And the third layer is endocardia. So let me show you this. Layers of the heart itself, or the heart wall. What I'm telling you basically here. So layers of the heart wall itself are going to be what we call visceral layer of the serous pericardium, as I've typed in the chat box. Myocardium, and if you guys remember, the word myo means muscle. So this is basically your heart muscle, cardiac muscle. And you may and may not know that, but they all are arranged in this circular or spiral pattern. And I'll show you a picture in just a minute. And the innermost lining, the one that basically comes into the contact with the blood that is inside your heart, that is called endocardium, which is what I wrote on the chat box again. These are made up of simple squamous epithelium. It's a very thin layer, and it's literally lining the cavity of the heart. Is this making sense so far, guys? So when you're answering questions about this, guys, please pay attention to, is it saying surrounding the heart, or is it saying the heart itself, or the layers of the heart wall? If I say the wall, the answer is one of these three. If I say surrounding the heart, your option would be either, again, the fibrous pericardium or the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. FYI, if you haven't noticed on the PowerPoint, visceral layer of the serous pericardium, also called epicardium as well. So there's a secondary name for it. So let's take a look at it on a picture, guys. Here is basically the total of the 5 layers that I'm talking about, from outside to inside. What you see kind of look like feathers or a rope that's been ripped apart. So this layer right here, that's your fibrous pericardium, the one that surrounds the heart. This layer right here, which is literally directly attached to that, that's called the parietal layer of your serous pericardium, which again surrounds the heart. And then this layer right here, and I'm gonna let me just do a coloring of this. So this layer, this is one layer, this is another layer, this is another layer. So 1, 2, 3, these are the layers of the heart itself. So the first one is the epicardium or visceral layer of the pericardium. The really thick one, that's kind of like muscles, you can say that, that's your myocardium, which is basically your heart muscle. And this thin white layer that's lining the inside of the heart, that's your endocardium. And what you see here, this space right here, basically, this is where your blood is basically circulating. Those are the cavities that are inside the heart. Any questions about this, guys? Any clarification? Now, in terms of the positioning of the heart, that's something else that I find very interesting for you guys to know. We already kind of discussed this when we were talking about the thoracic cavity and ventral cavities at the beginning, the first lecture we did. Kind of a reminder for you guys. Your heart is located within your thoracic cavity. The cavity itself, if you guys remember, is called the pericardial cavity or pericardium. It is, if you take a look, this line, the red line that you see, that's kind of have that dome shape, that's your diaphragm. You can see it also here. Diaphragm is a muscle that's part of your respiratory system, but it's also where your heart sits. The other thing that's very clear in this image is the shape of your heart, guys. So we don't have that beautiful Valentine-shaped heart. What in reality, your heart is more cone-shaped. So you can see it in this picture. If you look at your heart, it is that shape of kind of sideways cone. So this basically a typical shape of your heart. The other characteristic of the heart that you see is that it has that pointy part to it right here. And then it has that kind of relatively flat top. So the heart basically has, again, a flat top and then kind of a pointy edge to it. So let me see if I actually have those vocabulary listed for you. No, I just want to make sure. So the pointy, I'm sorry, for the pointy part of the heart is your heart apex. The top of the heart, and I'm writing this in your chat box so you guys have that. The top of the heart where all the blood vessels either enter or exit the heart is your base. And I write this down, guys, for you guys to make sure you understand that when you automatically think about base, the word base, you always think on the bottom, right? So in this case, your heart, the base actually is on the top, and the pointy part, the apex of the heart, is at the bottom. So make sure you guys can make that distinction, please. Something also interesting, which I will talk about when we look at your respiratory system next week or the following week, is that see how the apex of the heart right here in this kind of the edge, it actually pushes into your left lung, and it literally creates this little cavity inside your left lung called the cardiac notch. I is it labeled here? No, it's called cardiac notch, and it literally makes your left lung smaller than your right lung. So your left lung is kind of on the smaller side compared to your right lung. So again, something we'll discuss later on. So now we have learned so far that your heart is divided to two parts, right? Right side, which is carrying the oxygenated blood. Left side that is carrying oxygenated blood. We learned that there are two circulation, pulmonary and systemic circulation. We also learned that there are two layers that surround the heart, and then three layers that actually makes up the heart itself. So now we're gonna dive into what are the actual structures of the heart itself. So one of the first things that you notice, and again, looking at the pictures that I've shown you already, here's a typical heart image. You have this central piece right here in the middle, okay? This part right here. This is a highly muscular structure which enable us to separate the right side of the heart from the left side of the heart. And this section is called interventricular septum. If you were in my lower division, I usually just accept the word septum, but please understand that if I ask you guys for the name of this structure, I do expect the full name, which is interventricular septum. And I'll explain the name in just a second where the word interventricular comes from. So give me 1 minute. Now, inside your heart, you actually have 4 chambers. Okay, so 4 total chambers or cavities inside your heart. 2 sits on the top, 1 on the right, 1 on the left. 2 sits on the bottom, 1 on the right, 1 on the left. The top chambers of your heart, so you can write basically atria are the top chambers of your heart. They are identified as the receiving chambers of the heart. So which basically implies that these are the ones where your veins bring blood back toward your heart. So if you logically think about your heart, guys, and I want you guys to, it's a very logical process. Blood comes in, okay, for both left and right side of the heart. It comes in from the top, empties to the atria, which is either the right atrium or the left atrium. It goes down with the force of gravity and a little bit of a squeezing. It goes down to the ventricles, which are the bottom chambers of the heart. And then these 2 bottom chambers of the heart, 1 on the right, 1 on the left again, are gonna squeeze the heart and push this blood out of the heart, okay? So to just think about your heart as a pump, the way that I want you guys to understand it, even if we don't want to use any terminology, guys, is blood comes in from the top, right? Blood vessels bring the blood from the top, from either right or left. Blood goes down toward the bottom chambers of the heart, which are basically going to be with the force of, again, gravity and contraction of the heart. And then that blood, as the heart squeezes, the blood is going to be pumped out of the heart, both from the right side and the left side. Is this making sense so far, guys? Is there any questions? This is really important, guys, because if you don't understand the basics, then it becomes more complicated because we're going to build upon that concept. No questions? So the concept of the heart, without looking at terminology, is blood vessels, both on the right and left side, bring blood from the top into the 2 top chambers of the heart. And then blood with the force of gravity, because gravity, everything gets pulled down, right? With the force of gravity, as well as the heart contracting, pushes everything to the bottom 2 chambers, okay? The 2 bottom chambers are now going to squeeze all of that blood out of the heart, 1 on the right-hand side, 1 on the left-hand side. Yes, so when it goes to the bottom chambers of the heart, and again, I don't want to introduce those whole arteries and veins right now, but yes, so the question says it goes back to the arteries and get out of the bottom chambers. So yes, the 2 bottom chambers, when they squeeze the blood is going out through your arteries. It doesn't matter what color it is, right? As far as the blood is moving away from the heart. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So quick note, guys, for everybody. The word atria is actually plural. So the singular version, when we talk about only right or left, is atrium. So you basically have right atrium and left atrium. If I'm talking about generally the chambers on the top of the heart, then we will say call them atria. Correct. So the question is, so when the blood goes through the veins, it goes to the heart. Yes, it comes to the heart. So all of the blood vessels that basically come to the atria, to the top part of the heart, are veins, and all of the ones that are connected to the bottom chambers of the heart are your arteries, correct? And we'll go ahead and give them a specific names, but yes, classification-wise between arteries and veins, you are correct, yes. So, atria, they are receiving chambers, and again, if you want to make a note for yourself, they're connected to veins, and the color does not imply anything red or blue, so I'm going to change it to black so you guys don't confuse this or another color. They are thin wall. Thin wall, it means there is basically not much muscle, so low muscle, sorry, low muscle. Sorry, my thing never works. Low muscles. Apologize for the typing. And again, they receive blood from both pulmonary and systemic circulation, which makes sense because we already established that right side of the heart is carrying the oxygenated blood, which is going to the pulmonary circulation. And the left side that carries good blood, oxygenated blood, is going to go through the systemic circulation. Cool fact about the atria is that they have these little additional flaps right on top of them. So they're called auricles or little ears. And they are important when your heart needs to pump a lot of blood, guys. So when it needs to have that extra space to bring in more blood toward the heart, then the auricles are basically going to open up. They kind of like balloon, they open up and they accept more larger volume of blood inside the heart. Normally, if you're sitting down, if you're relaxing, normally you will not have the activity of the auricles. The auricles are just basically closed up. They're like these little flaps that are closed up. If your heart needs them, then the auricles open up to give more space inside your heart. Now, note that the muscles that are found on your heart atria, they're called pectinate muscle. So there's patterns of muscles that you can see inside the heart. These are called pectinate muscle. They're only found in the atria and mostly on the right atrium. And you'll see that in just a second. I'll show you a picture. So here is our heart, guys. And again, this is your bread and butter when it comes to knowing and heart image for your exam, guys. This is the image I almost always use. So make sure you guys feel comfortable with this. So the two chambers we're talking about on the top. Here is one chamber, that's your right atrium. Here is the second chamber on the left-hand side, that's your left atrium. So left atrium and right atrium. The pattern of the muscles that you see right here, those are your pectinate muscle that I mentioned earlier. Now, the bottom chambers of your heart are called ventricles. So ventricles are basically going to be the chambers that are larger. They are located on the bottom of the heart. And their job, again, is to pump blood out of your heart. Because their job is to pump, not just simply receive blood, but to pump it, they're going to have a thick wall. And again, if you're looking at this word thick wall, what I mean by that is lots and lots of muscle. They have a thick myocardium, okay? Now, they do have a pattern inside these muscles have a pattern inside called trabeculae. And again, I'll show you here on this pattern. These are trabeculae, these patterns you see in the background. That's the trabeculae muscles that we're talking about. The full name is trabeculae corneae, but you can also refer to it as the trabeculae. Now, typical exam question. Which of the four chambers of the heart has the thickest myocardium? Okay, again, myocardium means that's the heart muscle. we already established that between the atria and between the ventricle, your atria is going to have your ventricles are going to have a thicker muscle. Well, what about between the right ventricle versus the left ventricle? Which one of those is going to have a thicker muscle, guys? And the answer would be the left ventricle, correct. Left ventricle, actually, if you look at the thickness, and again, I'll show you just in just a second, is 2 to 3 times thicker than your right ventricle. The reason for this is, if you think about this, looking at your heart, the right side of the heart pumps blood to your pulmonary circulation. So not that far, right? Pulmonary circulation is right there. You don't have to basically travel that much, right? Your lungs are right here, your heart is at the center. I don't need to pump super hard to send blood from my heart to my lungs. However, correct. However, when we're looking at my left ventricle right here, if you guys recall from the picture that I showed you earlier, which I'm going to go back to so you guys can recall this, the left side of the heart, what is it pumping blood to? It's pumping blood through the systemic circulation, which basically means it's pumping blood to your whole body. So because of that, you need to create a higher pressure. How do I create higher pressure? By creating a thicker muscle. Those muscles, when they contract, they create a lot of force, and that force is basically enables you to create a larger pressure. So I'm going to retype the question so everybody has that. Oops, not that. So, oh, sorry. Technical difficulties. Okay, so the question is, which chamber of the heart has the thickest myocardium? And again, the answer would be left ventricle, because it is pumping blood to the systemic circulation, which basically means your whole body. So it needs more muscle to create a stronger contraction / force. Question about that, guys? So just don't say simply left ventricle. You need to understand why is left ventricle has the thickest. Is because you need a lot of force, because you need to pump that blood to the whole body, versus the right ventricle, you just need to pump to the lungs, which are on either side of the heart. So when somebody, let me put this in a perspective for you. When somebody has a heart attack, guys, you know how sometimes say, oh, the person had a mild heart attack, or they had a cardiac arrest, which basically may lead to death? Which chamber of the heart is going to be the most dangerous to have a blocked blood vessel on it? It would be your left ventricle. Because if the left ventricle doesn't receive good oxygenated blood so it can contract strongly, then basically the rest of your body is doomed. Your atria that is on the top, they do contract, right? But the most of the job is done by gravity. Gravity just pulls them down. So if I have a heart attack that is happening on the atria or affecting the atria, the person probably going to be okay. If the heart attack is affecting the right ventricle, the chances are that person's gonna be okay. But if the heart attack is damaging the left ventricle, the chances of that person is in danger of death. So keep that in mind. Any questions so far, guys? Any questions about what I've discussed so far? Okay. So here is my chambers on the bottom of the heart. So that's my right ventricle right here. And this chamber right here is my left ventricle. And again, the pattern that you see inside, the pattern of the muscles you see, not these finger-like extensions, but rather these pattern in the back, those would be your trabeculae muscles or trabeculae carneae muscles as a full name for it. Okay, we're good on time, just want to make sure. So now that we know the 4 chambers of the heart, let's take a look at our main blood vessels that are either coming to these chambers or leaving these chambers. So we already established, guys, that the blood vessels that are associated, so let me type this for you guys. Blood vessels associated with our atria are always veins, and blood vessels associated with ventricles, it doesn't matter left or right ventricle, guys. Oh, sorry. Ventricles are going to be arteries. Sorry, my spelling is a little bit off. Yes, so left and right ventricles are your chambers 3 and 4, correct. If you're numbering them like 1, 2, 3, 4, yes, but those are your 4 chambers, correct. So going back to this part, this slide, so arteries are always going to be associated with your ventricles, and your veins are always going to be associated with your atria. So let's take a look, guys. Arteries are blood vessels, we already established this, that are moving blood away from the heart. Now, for the heart itself, these are blood vessels of the heart, guys, not just blood vessels of the body, but the ones that are directly connected to your heart. The main arteries of the heart are your aorta, which is coming from your left ventricle and basically takes blood to your systemic circuit. So let's stop here and think about this, guys. What is the type of blood, type, which means oxygenated versus deoxygenated? What is the type of blood that is found on the left side of the heart? What type of blood is on the left side of the heart? What type of blood is on the left side of the heart? Is it red or blue, guys? The left side of the heart. Red, which means it is oxygenated blood, correct. So if it's oxygenated, where do I want to send that blood to? If it's oxygenated blood, I want to send it to the tissue, well, body, correct, which means I'm sending it to what? My systemic circulation, correct? Immediately, guys, before you talk about anything, as soon as you hear left, think about red, which means oxygenated. Where do I want to send that oxygenated blood? To my body, so the body can use that oxygen. So reverse that, guys. What color is the right side of your heart, color-wise? Blue, correct. So blue means the blood is what? Blue means the blood is deoxygenated, correct? So where do I want to send that to? The oxygenated blood, which is low in oxygen, where do I want to send it to? To my pulmonary circulation, which is also known as my what? My lungs, correct. So look at this, guys. Pulmonary trunk gonna come off of my right ventricle, right? Immediately, guys. Right is blue, which means it doesn't have oxygen. If it doesn't have oxygen, where do I want to send it? I want to send it to my lungs, so it goes through the pulmonary circulation. So we take a look at these 2 arteries now. Let's take a look at it in a picture. So in a heart, again, my students kind of think about it, oh, it's going to be this beautiful thing that is so easy. I can identify this blood vessels coming from there. It's a little bit more complicated, that, guys. It's not a clear cut that this blood vessel is coming from there. So I'm just going to kind of highlight that for you here. If I'm looking at the arteries on the right side of the heart, so this is my right ventricle, correct? We established that. Right ventricle, do you see this big blood vessel? So from here to here. This big blood vessel right here is my pulmonary trunk. And you can see it goes up. So you can see the color, guys. The color is blue, which means the blood is deoxygenated. Please mute yourself. I don't know who that is, but please mute yourself. I'm gonna mute you. I guess it's easier. So pulmonary trunk is going to go to your lungs. It is blue color, which means the blood is deoxygenated. And now the left ventricle, which is this side, we already established the color is red. The blood vessel or the artery that comes off of that ventricle is called aorta, which is this big blood vessel you see right here. So I know you guys can see clearly that it's coming off of your left ventricle, but in reality, the blood vessel is like this. So it goes like this. So this is your blood vessel right here. That's your aorta. So this red blood vessel that's coming off of the left ventricle, it kind of has, it goes up and then it twists and goes behind the heart and comes back down. So aorta is right behind the pulmonary trunk. It pops up right here. It twists, it goes behind the heart and pops up right here. So what you see down here is also your what? Or if I can type, this is also your aorta. Okay, so if I gave you guys down here or up here, they're both aortas. They're not two different blood vessels. It goes behind, comes back down behind the heart and pops up right there. Now, veins are the ones that are gonna return blood back toward the heart. So without looking at this, guys. Right. Yeah. Don't sneeze. Sorry about that. So when you're looking at the veins, so let's think about this. If a vein is coming toward the right side of the heart, vein that is coming to the right side of the heart, is it going to be oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood? It's coming to your right side of the heart. Correct. The answer is deoxygenated, because right side, immediately when you hear right side, you have to say deoxygenated. There is no other option, guys. Right side, everything on the right side, from the blood vessels to the chambers of the heart, is going to carry deoxygenated blood. Now, here's the thing, guys. For the veins that are coming into your right atrium, okay, blood vessels that are, the veins that are coming to your right atrium, your heart is in the middle of your chest, right? Which means when I'm collecting blood that is deoxygenated, some of that blood is coming from my head, my neck, my arms, right? And the top part of my chest. And some of the blood that is being collected is coming from my legs and my abdominal cavity, right? Because my heart is in the middle. So the vein that is bringing blood from the top part of my heart, the one that's collecting deoxygenated blood from the top part of my heart, is called superior vena cava. So here is my right atrium. Here is my superior vena cava dumping blood into my right atrium. The one that is collecting from my belly, my legs, that is coming from below, is called what? Inferior vena cava. And it's right here, guys. Again, look at the color, it's blue, and it pops up right here. So this little opening that you see right here, this is the opening to this blood vessel. So it comes in like this, and it pops up right here. So if I ask you how many veins, main veins, are associated with the right atrium, how many veins are associated with the right atrium? So far, we know 2 main veins, right? Superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. Correct? Everybody with me so far? I have a question for you now. Where is this blood that is in your inferior and superior vena cava? Is it coming from my body or is it coming from my lungs? Where is this blood in the superior and inferior vena cava coming from? From body or from my lungs? From the body, correct. Because it's what? Because the color is what? The color is blue, which means my body has used up the oxygen, packed it with carbon dioxide, and it says, go away. Please be careful, guys, with the word no oxygen. It doesn't mean there is no oxygen. In reality, without me going into details, you go to it for physiology. If you are using your rest amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen, so at rest, while you're sitting down and you're not doing any physical activity, your saturation is about 75%. So you're only using very little of that oxygen. So it is lower, relatively lower, but you're still 75% saturated. So it's not that there is no oxygen. You still have 75% of your oxygen. It's just not 100%. So be careful, don't use the word no oxygen. Okay. Now let's take a look at, and I have a question for you first. Let's look at the left side of the heart. The blood vessels, the veins that are coming into my left atrium. Take a second to imagine it. Blood vessels that are coming into my left atrium. What kind of blood are they carrying? Blood vessels that are coming into my left atrium. Are they carrying oxygenated blood or deoxygenated? Or red or blue, basically. They're carrying oxygenated, correct. So immediately, guys, when you think about left, you should think what? Red, oxygenated, right? There is no other option for you guys, right? So if it's red, think about this, guys. If it's red, what does that imply? Is it coming from my body or is it coming from my lungs? It comes from my lungs, correct. Because what is lung going to do? Give it oxygen, right? So if it's really packed with oxygen, it can't come from my body because body uses up oxygen. So your lungs is giving oxygen to your blood vessel, to your blood, and that blood is coming back towards your heart. Correct. Now you have 2 lungs, right? Right lung and left lung. So from these 2 lungs, you actually come and bring 4 blood vessels into your heart. 2 of them again come from the right, 2 of them come from the left. Now, what's another word for your lungs, guys? What's another word for your lungs? Start with a P. Pulmonary, correct. So these are pulmonary veins because again, pulmonary as in they're coming from the lungs and they're coming back toward the heart. So here are your 2. These are from your left side. So here, left pulmonary veins right here. And again, these 2 right here that I have on this side. Common confusion, guys. Please pay attention to this. These 2 that I'm marking as right pulmonary veins, they're not coming in here, guys. They're actually going behind the heart and emptying right here. So their destination is still left atrium. They don't go into the right atrium. And again, this is a really common misconception I see among the students. They say, well, they're right here. They're emptying into this chamber. No, they're right here, but they're actually behind the heart. They continue and then dump their blood into the left atrium. Are you with me so far, guys? Any questions? So let's look at this, guys. Now that we know the name of the blood vessels, let's take a look at them, and I want to track this for you guys. So let's start with our superior and inferior vena cava. And I'm gonna ask you guys questions so you guys can track this. So blood that is coming from superior and inferior vena cava empties into what? Blood that is coming from superior and inferior vena cava empties into, actually, I'm sorry, let me backtrack. I'm just gonna walk you guys through this and then we'll do a practice run. Okay, so I'm gonna do it myself first so you guys can get familiar, and then we'll go through that together and I'll ask you guys questions. But I'm gonna do it once so everybody's on the same page. So blood comes in from the superior and inferior vena cava into your right atrium. From right atrium, it goes down to your right ventricle. From right ventricle, it gets pumped through the pulmonary trunk, which is this big one right here. And I forgot to mention that, I apologize. Pulmonary trunk, actually, because you have two lungs, is going to branch into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Right and left pulmonary arteries end at your lungs, where you have that gas exchange taking place. Blood goes from deoxygenated to oxygenated and comes back through the right and left pulmonary veins into the left atrium. From left atrium, blood moves down to your left ventricle. From left ventricle, blood gets pumped out through your aorta, out toward your systemic circulation. So now let's take a look at some of the questions for you. And I'm just gonna put that randomly so you can see if you guys can follow. Where does the blood from the right ventricle goes to? What blood vessel? From the right ventricle. Blood from the right ventricle. What blood vessel does it go through? From the right ventricle, where does it go to? I only have one answer and 30 students, so. Come on, guys. Blood from the left ventricle goes through what blood vessel? Oh, sorry. No, I apologize. From the right ventricle. Sorry. Right ventricle. I apologize. Right ventricle first goes through pulmonary trunk, guys. Don't forget that. First through the pulmonary trunk and then branches to the left and right pulmonary artery. So right ventricle sends blood through the pulmonary trunk and then pulmonary arteries. What blood vessels, I'm going to type the answer question. So what blood vessels bring blood to left atrium? What blood vessels bring blood to left atrium? What blood vessels bring blood to left atrium? Guys, think about the question. You're not in a rush. If it's coming back toward the heart, immediately you should think about what, guys? Veins or arteries? Veins. And if it's the left side of the heart, If it's the left side of the heart, it cannot be blue. So it cannot be superior inferior vena cavas, guys. So the answer is right and left pulmonary veins. So the correct answer is to my question is right and left pulmonary veins. So another question. What blood vessels come into your right atrium? What blood vessels come into your right atrium? What blood vessels come into your right atrium? So 3 out of 30 students answering the question is not a good sign, guys. Superior and inferior. Okay, so be careful, guys. If you just tell me superior and inferior in your exam, that's not going to give you a full credit. If you only say superior vena cava or only inferior vena cava, that's also not going to give you your full credit. So the answer says, what blood vessels comes into your right atrium? The full answer so far, you know, would be superior and inferior vena cava. So here's another question. These are actually, guys, exam questions. So it kind of gives you what style of questions I'm asking you. So you better be comfortable with this. And I don't want to hear you guys, oh, these are not anything that we discuss in a class. So don't want to hear that. So what is the destination of aorta? What is the destination of aorta, guys? And you can answer it in terms of lungs, body, tissue, pulmonary circuit, systemic circuit, any of those would do. But as far as it's the right the thing. Okay. So what is the destination of aorta? Systemic circuit, correct. So systemic circuit, which basically means your body or tissue, which I can use these terminology interchangeably. Make sure you guys are comfortable with that. Okay, what is the destination of pulmonary arteries? What is the destination of your pulmonary arteries, guys? Look at the word. What does the word pulmonary implies, guys? Lungs, right? Use your common sense, guys. You don't need to kind of go and make this more difficult than it is. So always think about the vocabulary. Look at the word arteries, veins. These will help you guys kind of direct your answers. So again, it says, if I write what is the destination of pulmonary arteries, you can say lungs, you can say pulmonary circuit or circulation. And again, the goal of that would be to basically give up your carbon dioxide and pick up new oxygen molecules. Is this making more sense? It's not going to be perfect, guys. I know it's going to take time for you guys to understand it. But if you have a general understanding of the following, the right side is deoxygenated blood, left side is oxygenated blood. The blood that comes up from the right side, so blood, oops, I don't know what happened. So blood on the, I'm going to type this, on the right side of the heart comes from systemic circuit and goes to pulmonary circuit blood on the left side comes from the pulmonary circuit and goes to your systemic circuit. If that makes sense to you guys, you are in a good position right now to kind of have a general understanding of the circulatory process of the heart. And then again, we're kind of building up on that. Here is what I've already discussed with you guys in a form of basically written statements. So right atrium, for instance, we talked about it, receives deoxygenated blood from both your body, which is superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. These are the two main ones that I talked about. I haven't mentioned coronary sinus for you guys yet. I will talk about it when we talk about the blood vessels of the heart itself, and then that becomes clear. Next one, what we have is, we're jumping kind of into the valves. So what time is it? 9:17. All right, I'll talk about the valves briefly and then we'll take a break. So how many chambers does your heart have? 4 chambers, easy, right? Now, if you're looking at the top chambers of the heart, they connect to the bottom chambers of the heart. So you have atria on the top and the ventricles on the bottom, right? So let's take a look at this, and I want you guys to understand it without us going through the names right now. When I have your heart, the top chambers, so the top chamber is going to bring in, do you guys see my hand, by the way? I don't know if I'm holding my hands too high or not. Okay, good. So you have the top chambers of the heart collecting the blood, and the blood comes down to the ventricles, right? So the atria collect the blood, and the blood comes down to the ventricle. Now, if I squeeze the ventricle, okay, it doesn't matter right or left, but I'm squeezing my 2 ventricles, where do I want the blood from the right ventricle to go through? Where do I want that blood to go? If I'm squeezing the right ventricle, where does that blood need to go? Through what blood vessel? If I'm squeezing my right ventricle, what blood vessel does it go through? Pulmonary what? Pulmonary trunk, correct. Good job. Now, think about this, guys. When I'm squeezing the ventricle, my goal is for the blood, and I go back to the picture for you guys. Hold on one second. When I'm squeezing the right ventricle, my goal is for the blood to go up through this pathway, correct? Which is my pulmonary trunk and eventually go to my lungs. However, if this part of the heart is being squeezed, the other option that your heart has is to pump blood back up to the atrium, to the right atrium. Do I want that to happen? The question is, do I want the blood to go back to where I just got that from? The answer is no, correct. So what is the solution? The solution is placing a valve right here, which is what you see in white color. So when my ventricle is contracting, this valve is gonna close up, which means I cannot go up where I came from, and therefore my only option would be going through the pulmonary trunk. If I'm looking at the left side, the same concept applies. If I push blood from the left atrium, down toward my left ventricle, I want that blood to go eventually out of my aorta, right? The blood vessel. I don't want that blood to go back up toward my left atrium again. So I have another set of valves right here, which again you see in white color. And these are the valves that are going to close up when my ventricle is contracting, so my blood doesn't go back toward my atrium. Now, the location of these valves, if you look at them, the location of this valve and this valve is between the atria and the ventricle. The location of this valve is between the atria and the ventricle. So the name of this valve is going to be called atrioventricular valve. So the location of the valve is basically telling me the name of the valve, atrioventricular. Now, I can call these valves atrioventricular. Go back. I can call this the right atrioventricular. You can't just say atrioventricular, guys, or AV. You have to say right AV or left AV valve. They also have secondary names, which comes from how many flaps these valves are made up of. Flaps is basically little things that form the whole valve, literally flaps. So the one that you have on the right-hand side, this one right here, if you look at it, it has 3 flaps. So we call that Tri-Cuspid Valve. Tri implies 3 valves or 3 cusps or 3 flaps. The one that is on the left-hand side, only has 2 flaps. So I call that either the bicuspid valve, bi as in 2, or a more known name might be mitral or mitral valve. So that has an additional name. So let's take a look at this, guys. I think I just logged in somebody in for the class. Make sure you guys sign in if you haven't done so. So atrioventricular valves, again, what is their job? To prevent the backflow of blood into the atria. Doesn't matter which atria, guys, right? Right or left. When what are they doing? When my ventricles are contracting. If it's on the right-hand side, the right AV valves is called tricuspid valve. It is made up of 3 cusps and lie again between the right atrium, sorry, not right atrium, right atrium and the right ventricle. Mitral valve or left AV valve or bicuspid valve is made up of only 2 flaps, hence the word bicuspid, and it's between the left atrium, again, and left ventricle. Now, one quick note when we're looking at these valves right here. Eraser. So here is the valve, guys, these white portions right here and right here. But you can also notice that they have these little strings coming off of them that keeps the valve in place. So you have these string-like extensions right here. And they're kind of connected to these finger-like extensions of muscles right here. So these have their own names. So here is my valve. Guys, pay attention to this because these are exam questions again. Here is my valve, which is the tricuspid or bicuspid. The little strings that are holding the valves, which is also visible on both of these, is called cordi tendini. So they're tendons that look like cords, basically. And they are secured in place with the muscles that you see right here, these finger-like extensions called papillary muscle. So pay attention when I'm doing labeling for you guys, both for the lab exam and for your lecture when it comes to images. If it's the valve itself, is either tricuspid or bicuspid. The little strings for both of them is called cordi tendini. And the little muscles that hold these little strings are called papillary muscle. Okay, so pay attention to what part is it exactly pointing to. Okay, now let's take our break. We're gonna stop right here. So it's 9:25 right now, guys. So we're going to pick up this at 9:40. So be back by 9:40. Go enjoy your 15-minute break, coffee break, bathroom break, whatever it is. And we'll pick up this. So hopefully your brain is not on overload right now. You guys do see my screen, right? I don't know. It says it's sharing, but it doesn't have that glow on it. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue with our portion about the valves. So we talked about the AV valves. So that's 2 out of the 4 valves that we have in the heart. I forgot to stop the video or pause the video. I just noticed, sorry. So you guys, if you're watching it, there's 15 minutes of nothing. Okay, so the second set of valves that we're going to talk about are known as semilunar valves. So basically the word semilunar implies that they are going to be half moon shapes. So when you look at these valves, I just want to show you guys. So these kind of look like cup shapes. So when they are basically when they get active or open, I should say, blood basically push past through them, and they find their way through the blood vessel. And then when they are engaged in terms of being close together and are actively closed, as the blood is basically coming back down, these valves are like this, and they come together because they get filled with the blood, and you kind of have them coming together and create these little cusps. And them coming together basically prevent the blood from back flowing. Now, where are they exactly located? Where these semilunar valves are actually located? So they're located between your ventricles, there you go, between your ventricles and their corresponding arteries. So without me looking at the name of these, if I say, what's the main blood vessel associated with the right ventricle? What would you say? Right ventricle. What's the main blood vessel for the right ventricle that comes off of your right ventricle? Take a moment. Anybody? What's the blood vessel that comes off of the right ventricle? Please don't tell me you forgot everything because we took a 15-minute break. I'm not giving you guys the answer. Give me an answer. Guys, remember, coming off of your right ventricle, it has to be an artery, not a vein. What's the name of the blood vessel that comes off of your right ventricle? So I had literally 3 different answers. So I want more responding from my students. Right ventricle. The answer is pulmonary trunk, guys. So remember, superior and inferior vena cavas are coming into the heart, into the right atrium. They're not coming out of the heart. They're coming into the heart. So the correct answer again, the blood vessel that's coming off of your right ventricle is going to be your pulmonary trunk. What is the blood vessel that is coming off of your sorry, I'm just going to type it for you guys so you have the question. Ventricle. What is the blood vessel that comes off of your left ventricle? The blood vessel that comes off of your left ventricle. Okay, so I have aorta. Anything else? Any other? Bicuspid is not a blood vessel. Bicuspid is a valve. What is the blood vessel that comes off of your left ventricle? Blood vessel, guys, not a chamber. So I have aorta as the answer. Any other things, guys? Anybody else wants to contribute? So the correct answer is your aorta, correct. So if you go back to the picture, here is heart. Here is my left ventricle. And left ventricle, remember, left ventricle is carrying oxygenated blood, which means it's going to go through your aorta to get that oxygenated blood to your body. So if I ask you, what is the blood vessel that comes off of your left ventricle? The correct answer would be aorta. Again, remember, trunk pulmonary is associated, if it's an artery, is associated with going toward your lungs, which means it is carrying deoxygenated blood, not oxygenated blood. So yes, please guys, practice. This is going to be, literally, these are what I'm giving you are exam questions. So if you guys can't practice those, or it doesn't make sense, you are going to be in trouble for that. So if it doesn't make sense, ask questions or go ahead and study on your own, but you have to be able to kind of figure out the anatomy of the heart. It is a big portion of your exam. Okay, so let's take a look, guys. So what I'm saying here is I have a squeeze. So let's review the valves. The first thing I do, if you're looking at the overall picture of the heart, you have your blood coming into your right atrium and your left atrium. Blood from those atria comes down to your two ventricles, right and left. And then when you squeeze the left ventricle and the right ventricle, your tricuspid valve and bicuspid valve get engaged, which kind of makes sense because I want to prevent the blood from going back up to my atria. So when the ventricles contract, blood is going up through the pulmonary trunk and through your aorta, which is right here. Now, after your ventricles contract, contraction is followed by relaxation, which means as the right ventricle starts to relax, the blood that I pushed up here through the pulmonary trunk kind of says, oh, I have a space down here. So the gravity kind of pulled the blood back down toward the left ventricle. Sorry, the right ventricle. So as I'm going to say one more time, as I squeeze the right ventricle, blood goes up through the pulmonary trunk. As soon as I start to relax my right ventricle, then blood goes like, oh, there is a space down here, so I want to kind of backflow to my right ventricle. Do I want that blood to come back to my right ventricle? The answer is no. I just pumped it out. Why do I want that blood to come back down? So at that time, these semilunar valves that I mentioned right here are going to be engaged. So as the ventricle is relaxing, these two valves come together and prevent the backflow of blood back into the right ventricle. Same applies to your left ventricle. So let's walk through this left ventricle. Left ventricle is squeezing or contracting. So it's going to push the blood up through the aorta, which is this blood vessel you see right here. As soon as the left ventricle relaxes, aorta says, well, I have a space down here. Gravity is going to try to pull the blood back toward the left ventricle. So what do I get engaged? These little two flaps that you see in the back, these little two bumps, it's the back portion of the two flaps. So what they do is they get engaged, this semilunar valve gets engaged and prevent the blood to come back from the aorta back into your left ventricle. Now, I can use the name right semilunar valve and left semilunar valve to name these valves. Or I can call them based on the blood vessels they are associated with. So this one right here is associated with my pulmonary trunk. So I can call this the pulmonary valve. These two little bulbs that I see that is connected to my aorta are called the aortic valve. as a nerve associated with aorta. Please do not call that the aorta valve. That's not the proper name. So it's aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. So let's look at the information, guys. The two semilunar valves, which is shorthand to SL valves, prevent the backflow of blood from the major arteries into your ventricles, right? You don't want that blood to come with the gravity when the ventricles are relaxed. They are opening and closing in response to pressure changes. Pressure changes implies when the heart is contracting, the pressure is high. When the heart is relaxing, the pressure is low. Each of these semilunar valves have three cusps, three of those little flaps that I showed you that resemble half moons. Again, we saw the semilunar shape of them. Now, detail again. Pulmonary semilunar valve located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, which is what we showed already, right? Here is the pulmonary valve right here, between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk right here. It prevents backflow when right ventricle is relaxing, right? So the semilunar valve is only engaged when the ventricles relax. Aortic valve, as the name implies, is going to be associated with your aorta and your left ventricle. And when it's going to be engaged is when my left ventricle is relaxing. So kind of a note for you guys, I'm typing it in the chat box. AV valves are engaged, or what I mean by engaged is that means they're closed when ventricles are contracting, and SL valves, which is the semilunar valves, are engaged or closed basically when my ventricles are relaxing. Okay? Another piece of information, again, to kind of put it in perspective. AV valves prevent backflow to atria. Doesn't matter which one I'm talking about. It's either right atrium or left atrium. And SL valves prevent backflow to ventricles. Is the idea make sense to you guys? Does this general idea make sense to you guys? Is it something that just doesn't click for you right now? Again, it does take practice, guys. It's not going to come to you over like 5 seconds and, oh, I got it. It took me a long time to remember the heart anatomy. So please take a long time to practice and make sure you guys are understanding this. Yes, it is a lot of information. I understand. Heart is one of the, I think, one of the more interesting organs in your body, but it's also complicated when you get introduced to it first. But I always tell my students to think about your heart as a very logical double pump. Right side is always blue, left side is always red. You always need to bring blood on the top and then bring it down to the bottom. And then if it's blue blood, basically, or deoxygenated blood, you have to have that deoxygenated blood going to your lungs for the purpose of being oxygenated. And if the blood is on the left side of your heart, what is the goal? To give that oxygen to your tissues. So it's gonna go to your aorta, go to your body, so you can bring that oxygen to your tissue. When it goes to the tissue, guys, what's gonna happen? It's going to give up its oxygen and pick up its carbon dioxide. So blood goes from oxygenated to deoxygenated. So you have to kind of go through this step by step for yourself. And as you go through this, it becomes a more logical process rather than memorization. And I don't recommend for you guys to memorize these things because it is not going to help you in an exam. This picture, I usually use it when we were actually doing a sheep heart dissection. We won't be able to get that exposure, unfortunately, in our setup right now. So I'm gonna skip this one for you guys. Here is the view of the 4 valves that we have. So these ones, see how it has 3 little flaps versus 2 flaps. So this is your tricuspid valve. This is your bicuspid valve. And then these 2 that are almost identical, these are your semilunar valves. That's associated with your aorta. You can see the red color. So that's your aorta or aortic valve. And this one is the pulmonary valve, which is associated with the pulmonary trunk. A couple of interesting pieces of information. So we call them homeostatic imbalances when we're talking about this, which means you are out of sync. Your heart is out of sync in some form. So in this case, when we're talking about this, one of it is the concept of incompetent valve. So incompetent valve is basically there is a blood that backflows to the chamber because the valve is not working properly. So heart basically repumps the same blood over and over again. The incompetent valve, a lot of time, you guys may have heard of the heart murmur before. Have you guys, anybody have heard of that before? When somebody has a heart murmur? So what they're talking about is basically one of the valves of the heart is incompetent, which means that the blood is not effectively circulating because there's a backflow. Interestingly, with the incompetent valve, as of, well, say 50 years ago, this has been kind of relatively routine, like 40 years ago maybe. It's been relatively routine where they can actually go in and remove the defective valve. And they have the option of either replacing it with a mechanical one or one that comes from animal, typically a pig, or a cadaver valve to begin to replace the incompetent valve. We also have something called valvular stenosis. This is when the valve is really like, it's kind of like a door that hasn't been oiled for a while. It's pretty stiff. So it has, it doesn't it doesn't open properly. So it has a difficult time opening. So it heart needs to basically really squeeze it to push those valves open. That puts extra strength on the, extra pressure on the heart. And in many cases, valvular stenosis actually leads to an enlarged heart because it forces the heart to basically work not over time, but with a stronger contractility, and that causes the muscle to enlarge. Either of those cases, a valvular stenosis also can be replaced again, but the more common thing that we see is the incompetent valve, which causes the heart murmur. Any question, guys? Any clarification on anything we described so far? You guys usually go into a lot more detail when we talk about this in physiology. I just kind of hinted at some of the conditions here. This is going to be this picture plus the other picture that we described with the heart being open and you could see the chamber. These are your friends in terms of studying for the exam. Yeah, you don't need it's okay. So the question is, we don't need a slide 19. That's not a sheep's heart. Actually, what you see is a human heart. But I usually describe the human heart or a cadaver heart in relation to a sheep's heart. But because we don't do that dissection, you guys don't need to be familiar with it. Right, correct. Okay, so for the images, guys, there is 2 images that you guys can see continuously popping up on the PowerPoint. It's one of this, which is the heart as a whole. And then the other one is basically this one that has the heart open and you can see the chambers and the valves. You really need to be comfortable with both of these images, guys. So do spend some time over that and make sure you guys are reviewing this and are on the same page when it comes to terminology. Okay, so let's look at some of the terminology that are here that I haven't discussed with you, and then we'll go into more details about them on our PowerPoint on the actual slide. So right here, again, we have the right atrium. Right here, we have the left atrium, sorry. These are the little flaps that I was telling you guys, those little extensions that are called the auricle. So those are what we actually see. What I would really like you guys to name them when I ask you guys, because it's hard to identify the auricles on these images, I would rather for you guys to just label this as the right atrium and the left atrium. It makes the process a lot easier. Now you have this blood vessel that kind of separates the ventricles on the surface of the heart, on the facade of the heart. So this portion of the heart would be your right ventricle, and this side would be the left ventricle. And this is the marker that separates those. Again, here is your superior vena cava and inferior vena cava coming into your right atrium. Here is your pulmonary trunk, which branches to the left and right pulmonary arteries. Here are your 4 pulmonary veins, right here to right here to right here. All 4, these 2 and these 2, empty into your left atrium, which goes down to the left ventricle. And again, left ventricle is going to pump the blood through your aorta right here. Something new that is labeled in this image is branching, or sorry, should I say branching? Segmentation of your arteries. So let's take a look at the largest artery we have in our body, which is aorta. So when I take the left ventricle and I come out of the aorta, the direction of the blood is moving up, right? Moving up. So we refer to this portion as the ascending aorta. So the full name of this portion of aorta is the ascending aorta because it's moving up, it's ascending. The curvature, which basically pushes the blood back down, that curvature that you see is referred to as the aortic arch. So the curvature itself is called the aortic arch. So if you want to get full credit in your exam, you cannot just simply refer to this as aorta. You need to give me this as the ascending aorta and the curvature as the aortic arch. I'm going to say, if you just say aorta, you get partial credit for that question. Now, off of your aortic arch, you have 3 branches that comes off of your aortic arch. The first branch is called brachiocephalic trunk or artery. You can replace this with the word artery. Second branch, which is called left common carotid artery. And third branch, which is called left subclavian artery. Okay. So I'm going to type a couple of pieces of information for you guys in your chat box to make sure everybody again on the same page. So brachiocephalic artery, okay, branches to, give me a minute, let me just type it and then we'll go over it. Branches into right common carotid artery and right subclavian artery. So this brachiocephalic that you see, if you continue that, and there are images in your lab that you see that, it branches to the right common carotid artery, which is parallel to this one, the middle one for the left side. And then you have one that goes over on the side, which is the subclavian that goes toward your arm. So here is another piece of information. Common carotid artery, item doesn't matter left or right, okay, goes up the neck and supply the neck and brain and facial muscles with oxygenated blood. So these ones, have you guys heard of, you know how like when they want to see if somebody is alive, they do this around their neck? So what they're actually doing, so when they do this either on one side or both sides, what they're actually doing is they're putting pressure on the either the left or the right common carotid artery, which runs right here. And that basically say that if the heart is pumping blood or not. It's relatively close to your skin, which means it's really easy to measure the pulsation. However, do not use that if you guys are using, if you're measuring, because if you put too much pressure on these blood vessels, you actually can cause decreased or insufficient oxygen supply to your brain, which can cause the person to pass out. So don't try that unless you are actually trained professional. Usually if you want to measure your pulse, you just use the radial artery down here. That's, you know how when they do chokeholds and the person passes out, so the chokehold basically cuts the supply through the carotid artery to your brain. Brain doesn't get oxygen, and as a result, that causes the person to pass out. Now, left, the blood vessel called subclavian arteries, which are both again right and left, goes over the clavicle. Clavian implies clavicle, goes over the clavicle and supply the arms and forearms. So basically, the branch that you see right here as the left subclavian artery, if you're thinking about the left side, it's gonna come up from your heart. It goes up over your clavicle. It goes right here and then extend over your arms and your forearms and eventually your hands. So subclavian arteries, doesn't matter left or right, they are supplying your arms and your shoulder with oxygenated blood. Is this making sense so far, guys? Is there any questions? Okay. Another structure that you can see visualized here is a structure called Ligamentum Arteriosum. It's this little connecting point between your pulmonary trunk and your aorta. This ligamentum arteriosum is actually a structure that was an opening in children, sorry, not children, in fetus. So when the baby is basically in mother's womb, it is a structure that basically connects the pulmonary circulation to the systemic circulation. Do babies have pulmonary circulation, guys? What do you think? Not babies, sorry, fetuses. Is there a pulmonary circulation for fetus? The answer is no, right? Because their lungs basically are not working, right? That's why the first breath is so important. So their lung is literally filled with fluid, correct? So what is happening is basically you're saying, I don't want the pulmonary trunk to send any blood to my lungs. So as the blood comes to the pulmonary trunk, that blood gets pushed to the aorta. So you're basically bypassing the pulmonary circuit. That's what the babies do. As soon as the baby takes his first breath, right? That's why it's so important for the, hearing that first breath. What happens is this connection closes up, okay? So there is no pulmonary trunk to aorta connection anymore, because at that point when the baby takes his first breath, the lungs are going to become active and you're going to have pulmonary circulation. So that structure becomes ligamentum arteriosum, which is basically a tendon at that point. It's not a blood vessel anymore. Okay. I'll talk about the blood vessels on the heart in the next few pictures. So Here is another really cool picture for you guys to use in terms of the circulation of blood through the heart, blood vessels, and the valves. This is a typical exam question, guys. Again, show me or write down the path for the blood through the heart and include your blood vessels, your valves, and your chambers. So here we have blood coming through the superior and inferior vena cava, as well as the coronary sinus that I mentioned before. Blood comes to the right atrium. It passes through the tricuspid valve and then gets into the right ventricle. It passes through the pulmonary semilunar valve, goes through the pulmonary trunk, goes through the pulmonary arteries, and then eventually into your lungs. That's where your gas exchange takes place, right? Your blood goes from deoxygenated to oxygenated. It returns through the 4 pulmonary veins that we have. And through the 4 pulmonary veins, it goes to the left atrium. Left atrium sends the blood through the mitral valve or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. Blood gets pumped from the left ventricle, passing through the aortic valve and goes through the aorta and eventually to the body. As it goes to the body, it goes from oxygenated again to deoxygenated and return to the heart through the inferior and superior vena cava. Should we always start with IVC? No, that it is a good place to start typically, but remember in your exam questions, what I can simply ask, it says, what is the valve that blood passes as it enters the right atrium, okay? So you need to understand this whole process in terms of answering the questions. But if I say write the path of blood through the heart, you can start anywhere. It doesn't matter. As far as you start with one point and then end up in the same place and your order is correct, that's fine with me. So this is a really good picture, guys, for you guys to test to make sure that you got the path of blood right. And again, a lot of students, when I ask questions as in write the path of blood, they either forget to include the blood vessels, they forget to introduce the chambers or the valves. This is the 3 components that you really need to include. Blood vessel, chambers, and the valves must be included for you to get the good picture of the circulation. Okay, so we're kind of shifting away now from like the heart anatomy briefly, and we're going into what actually gives the heart ability to create pumping action, or basically its heartbeat. So heartbeat of your heart, if you're looking at average, it's about 70 to 80 beats per minute at rest. That being said, what's considered normal, it's actually a larger range. It's 60 beats per minute up to 100 beats per minute. For instance, my dad is a relatively good athlete. His heartbeat at resting is at 45. Does that mean he's unhealthy? No, he just has a relatively low resting heart rate. The more sedentary lifestyle you live, or if you are pregnant, or if you have some sort of medical condition, you may be on the upper end of the heartbeat range. The more active you are, the healthier you are, your heartbeat is on the lower range. But a lot of people just genetically may have a higher heart rate. It doesn't really mean anything. And then again, these numbers that I'm giving you guys are only for adults. Of course, if you have ever been around a baby, a newborn, you know that the heart rate is much higher. And as they get older, then because the heart becomes more prominent in size, it doesn't need to beat as many times. So the heart rate decreases as the child grows basically into adulthood. The process of the heartbeat has two steps. We already know we have contraction and relaxation or expansion. So the contraction phase is called systole, and the relaxation phase is called diastole. If you have ever looked at your blood pressure machine, have you seen the numbers for your blood pressure? What is the common number that you want to have for your blood pressure? Anybody? 120 over the other way. 120 over 80. Sorry, I had a piece of ice. So basically those numbers are, so be careful guys. The bigger number is first, the smaller number is second. So when your heart is contracting, pay attention to this. When your heart is contracting, you're creating a larger pressure. So your systolic pressure is the higher number. So systolic pressure, I'm going to type it for you guys. Systolic pressure is associated with ventricle, more specifically your left ventricle, contracting, creating an average pressure of 120 millimeter of mercury, which is the unit mmHg. So when you hear the word systole or systolic, it implies your muscles, your ventricles are contracting. They're squeezing the blood out. That's where the pump is actually working. Diastolic pressure is when left ventricle is relaxing. So basically limited pressure, you're lowering the pressure. So the pressure is hovering around 80 millimeter of mercury. So the larger number is basically your heart is squeezing blood out. The smaller number is when your heart is relaxed. FYI guys, if you have what we call hypertension, which is high blood pressure, that typically means your systolic at rest is above 140 millimeter of mercury, and your diastolic at rest is above 90 millimeter of mercury. And not 160, 160 is really high. So 160 is for people that are like maybe in their 80s and 90s and they have what we call calcification of the blood vessels. So what we're talking about is a regular individual having like an adult, as a relatively healthy adult, having a systolic pressure above 140 and then a diastolic above 90. Sometimes my student asks me like, well, you know, like I exercised and my pressure was like 150 over 100. I'm like, that's okay. The key word here is at resting, which means you technically should not be putting a lot of pressure on your heart for your heart to work extra hard. So even at relaxation, your heart is working hard, and that's not a good thing. That can cause major problems for the heart, including burst blood vessels. It also could be a sign of a blood vessel being blocked. It could lead to heart attack. So there's a lot of the problems that could be associated with this. It also can cause problem with your kidneys, with your urinary system as a whole. It can damage the nephron. It can cause renal failure. So it has to be taken seriously. If you guys are diagnosed, you have to take medication that helps with lowering your blood pressure. And then one last thing for your information on this part is if I ask you which number is actually worse to be high. So is it worse to have a high systolic or worse to have a high diastolic pressure? Some people have both of them high. But it is worse to have the diastolic pressure. Correct. It's worse to have your diastolic pressure higher because when your heart is pumping, you expect the number to be high. So if your systolic is high, it's bad, but it's not as bad. But when you're saying your heart is relaxed and your pressure is still high, that means that your heart is even having problems when it's relaxing, and that's what would be concerning. So diastolic pressure is the one that would be more dangerous if it is high. Yes and no. So the diet does help with high blood pressure, more specifically diets that are low in sodium. So sodium is a big contributor into having high blood pressure. The main reason is when you have a lot of sodium or salt in your blood, it pulls water into your blood, increasing the blood volume and basically causing more pressure on your blood vessels. However, that being said, there are people that have significant, they control their diet. My dad is one of them, but it's a genetically inherited condition, and regardless of what they do in their diet, they will still have it. So even if you cut salt completely off of their diet, it might not do anything for you. So it depends. But again, if you add that salt in your diet, then your pressure would definitely go even higher than that. So, but the biggest contributor would be salt. Okay. Exercise helps significantly. Yes, diet and exercise are both good. But again, there are people that have that are genetically at a higher risk of developing high blood pressure. Running in my family, for instance, is high blood pressure. Even if I exercise, it's kind of nature versus nurture, the whole concept of what I've gotten from my parents versus what environment can do to me, which is like diet and exercise. So I'm cautious about saying that. Again, my dad is in really good condition. His heart rate is low, but his blood pressure is high. So I know he exercises because it shows in his heart rate, but he has a high blood pressure and has to take medication for it. He can control it. He controls his diet. He exercises, but that's not enough. However, if you don't have the history and it's directly nurture, which means the environmental components is affecting you, diet and exercise would be a great way to help you lower your blood pressure. Honestly, and I'm gonna get this to all of you guys and hopefully kind of get stuck to you, diet and exercise can resolve many of our health issues, including preventing cancer, Alzheimer's, and dementia. There's actually direct relationships or correlations between people who consume a lot of sugar and are overweight to developing Alzheimer's and dementia in later years. So you might not see the result of it now if you're consuming a lot of sugar, but the chances of you developing Alzheimer's or dementia in later years will significantly increase by folds if that is a big part of your diet. And that's why I recommend, especially if you have little ones at home, get them into the habit of eating healthier. And I'm really cautious because I have a 2.5-year-old at home. I know it's not easy to have them eat healthy, but learn moderation. That's what I always tell people. I give her cheese puffs. I give her her chocolate and candy because you have to, because there's no way around it. But I also make sure that she knows that she has a limit in every day, that she can't get more than that, regardless of how much she begs, because they're pretty good at that too. So learn that concept of moderation, teach them at early age, and that way they can manage their own diet later on in life. So give them those good habits now. Sorry, I kind of go off track sometimes. Okay, so let's come back to this. So let's talk about the heart sounds. So we have 4 valves, and each of those valves, when they close, they make a sound, okay? Now, generally, if you are just listening to the heart sound without going into a specific part of the heart, you have 2 sounds. They are called lub-dub. Okay, lub, the portion that's lub. You know how like do 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 that sound. Sorry, right? The typical sound you make for the heart. So lobe is associated with closing of the AV valves. And I'm typing this so you guys have it. And the dub sound is associated with closing of the semilunar valves. So if I ask you guys, what is the two sounds of the heart and what are they associated with? This is what I'm looking for. That's a very general statement. However, if I ask you, what about each specific valve? So we have 4 valves. What is the semilunar valve on the right side versus the left side can be heard. For that, we are referring to this image right here, which is the picture you see. So the semilunar valves that are pulmonary valves and the aortic valves. The pulmonary valves, so I'm just looking at the location, guys. You're not an EMT, so you don't need that perfect location right now, or nurse. So we're just looking at location rather than the second intercostal space between the right sternal margin. I don't want you guys to know that. But this is what you want to see. Right upper corner of the heart, left upper corner of the heart, lower right side of the heart or lower left side of the heart. That's what we want to look at, okay? So your pulmonary valve is heard on the left side of the top portion of the heart, or the top left portion of the heart. The reason for this, and people get confused because you hear pulmonary, right? Pulmonary artery is on the right-hand side. So why can't I hear it on the left-hand side? Is because the blood vessel curves. So the best place, and I'm going to type this in the chat box as well for you guys. Pulmonary valve is heard on the left. Here is the keyboard, guys. On the left upper portion of the heart. Okay. So reverse that for the aortic valve. So if pulmonary is heard on the left-hand side, then the aortic valve is heard on the right-hand side. So aortic valve is heard on the right upper portion of the heart. Tricuspid and bicuspid, they don't move because you just kind of go down on the same side. So it's either on the right side or the left side. So tricuspid is heard on the right lower portion of the heart, and bicuspid is, sorry, not head, heard on the left lower portion of the heart. So the tricuspid and bicuspid or mitral valves are heard on the right side, on the side that they are located. The aortic valve and the pulmonary valve are heard on the opposite side because of the way the blood vessel twists. And again, the details are here. If you want to learn it for your sake, to be prepared for your nursing school, or again, if you're an EMT or you're interested in EMT, then you wouldn't need to learn this specific locations, but otherwise you are good with the description that I provided for you. And that's the reason, you know, when the doctors tell you, like, they keep moving their stethoscopes when they're doing the heart, what they're listening to is each of these valves and making sure that the valves are working properly and you don't have a valvular stenosis or an incompetent valve. That's what they're actually listening for. Okay. The next thing I want to talk to you guys about is the conduction system of the heart. So what does that exactly mean? So if you guys remember when we talked about muscular system, we said that the reason my skeletal muscle contract, the ability of me to contract my skeletal muscle, is because I have a nerve impulse from my brain going to my muscle and telling that muscle you need to contract. You guys, does it sound familiar to you guys? So We said the control of your skeletal muscle was under the control of your nervous system. And what I also said is if your nervous system is damaged, like you have a stroke, then you are basically unable to control part of your muscles. And that's what we see, paralysis of the muscle, right? The person, half of their body is paralyzed. Now, in case of your heart, you may have heard of people that are considered brain dead, but they're still alive. And the concept of them being alive is because their heart is still pumping. So their brain is not active, but their heart is still pumping. What this indicates is that the heart does not need electrical impulses or signals from your nervous system to pump. So in another word, your heart is independent of your nervous system when it comes to creating the action of pumping of the heart. So the question is, how does your heart create the electrical impulses that leads to its contracting? How does your heart create electrical impulses that leads to it contracting? It does that using what we call intrinsic conduction system. So intrinsic, yes, intrinsic conduction system. Intrinsic conduction system basically means it is a network of non-contractile, and I'm typing this in the chat box so you guys have it, non-contractile cells in the heart that create electrical impulses that lead to muscle contraction, or basically your heart pumping. Not pumping. Yes, your heart has its own electrical system. That's basically what it means. So your heart has no need from your brain in terms of you need to pump, you need to pump, you need to pump. So this intrinsic conduction system, which means it's in the house. Intrinsic means in the house. It's inside the heart itself. It starts with what we call an SA node or cyanoatrial node. Cyanoatrial node is located, or it's called the pacemaker of the heart. This first one is called the pacemaker of the heart. And it creates something we call sinus rhythm. You may have heard of that if you watch like the ER shows and things like that. That basically means a normal heart rhythm, an average of 75 heartbeats per minute. And again, that number differs from one person to another. It can range from typically between 70 to 80, but it can go as low as 60 and as high as 100. So if I say, this is again an exam question, what is the pacemaker of your heart? What sets the rhythm of your heart? Your answer should be your SA node or your cyanoatrial node. Now, cyanoatrial node is actually, if you look at the image that I have, and I'm going to move forward so I can show you the image. Cyanoatrial node is located on the top of your right atrium. So if I say what part of the intrinsic conduction system is located on the top of the right atrium, that would be your cyanoatrial node or SA node. Now, SA node passes the message, passes its electrical conduction system from the top of the heart to the next structure right here called the AV node. AV, as we learned before, it stands for atrioventricular node. So you have the SA node followed by the AV node. AV node goes down into your septum or interventricular septum as this big branch right here, what you see right here, called the AV bundle. AV bundle. And then it branches to right and left bundle branches. So it basically says, okay, I have to both supply the right side and the left side with the electrical impulse. So I'm going to separate and I'm going to branch. And that ends with these little tiny branching that you see coming off called the Purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers. So going back to this whole concept, this is something that sometimes doesn't click for people. If I say, what sets the rhythm of the heart? What would you say? What sets the rhythm of the heart? Which of these structures sets the rhythm of the heart, guys? The SA node, correct. Now, SA node starts the process, passes the message to the AV node. AV node passes us to the AV bundle. Then the right and left bundle branches, and then eventually Purkinje fibers. What they're actually doing is spreading electrical impulses in the heart that again leads to muscle contraction. Please do note that, and I have it here, if there is an absence of SA node, so for some reason, let's say for a heart attack, electrical shock, just damage to the heart, drug intake, whatever the reason, if SA node is unavailable, so it's not doing what it's supposed to do, then AV node is going to take over. So for whatever reason, if SA node is not working, the responsibility of creating electrical, I'm typing this in the chat box, so we got electrical impulses falls on the AV node. However, AV node is not as strong as SA node, so the average heartbeat drops to about 50 beats per minute. Okay, so it's not basically going to be as strong as what we would see for SA node. The way I kind of think about it is SA node is your president and AV node is your vice president, guys. So if you're, for whatever reason, if the president is not available, then your vice president takes over. But the vice president will not have the same power as the president, okay? So it's the second one in command, but it doesn't have the same power. Same, you kind of go through this, guys. If AV node is absent, then the responsibility gets passed to the AV bundle, then the left and right bundle branches, and eventually Purkinje fiber. Please do note, though, that when the responsibility falls to these three, the last three, usually the heart rate is way too low, and that means that you will not be able to circulate the blood effectively for you to actually survive. So a lot of people actually end up basically passing out or may even die as a result because they are unable to basically have that proper circulation in their system. Okay, so the one that are really keeping you alive or can keep you alive for a longer period of time are your SA node and the AV node. Any question, guys? Any clarification, anything? Be comfortable with this picture, guys. Know the order for the conduction system, because I can say, what is the message from the SA node get passed to? What's the next structure after the AV node? What's the smallest branching of the conduction system? Things like that, which is your Purkinje fiber. So know the path so you can kind of follow what comes before that or what comes after. Okay, one of the last concepts I want to talk about with you guys is supplying the heart itself with the oxygen it needs to actually work. So a very cool fact about your heart. So your heart starts beating in about 4 weeks of embryonic development. So within 4 weeks of an embryo forming, you actually have a heart that is pumping blood, which is pretty early on. Now, this heart basically is going to pump from that moment until the moment of your death, unless you have a heart attack somewhere in the middle of the way. So it might stop. So that means if you want that heart to actively pump, you need to have muscle contraction. Muscle contraction needs a lot of energy. And for us to make energy, we need a lot of oxygen, which is something we established when we talked about muscular system. So the question here is, what are the blood vessels that supply the heart itself with oxygenated blood? And then what are the blood vessels that collect the deoxygenated blood and return it back to the heart? Which is kind of interesting because a lot of people like, wait, the heart itself needs oxygen? So yes, the heart itself needs oxygen, and it also needs a system to collect the oxygenated blood. So the heart supplies its own oxygen and then collects its own deoxygenated blood. So the arteries that are supplying the heart itself, the blood vessels that are supplying the heart itself, are called coronary arteries. So coronary again implies it is associated with your heart. They are originating from your aorta, which kind of makes sense because aorta is the one that's going to supply your whole body. Listen to this, guys. It's going to blow your mind away. 1/20 of the blood supply that your body circulates goes directly to your heart. 1/20. That's a significant amount of blood that goes to your heart, considering your heart to the rest of your body. Your heart is a relatively small organ. It's the size of your fist, but it uses 1/20 of your oxygen, which is huge. I mean, like, it always blows my mind when I think about it. So let's take a look at the coronary circulation. And I want to kind of show you this on an image rather than just looking at the slides, and we can look at the images in just a second. Sorry, the slides in just a second. So here is my aorta. You can now identify it by the aortic arch and that curvature, basically. So off of the aorta, before even aorta goes anywhere, send the blood to anywhere in your body, your heart says, I'm going to take my share of blood first, okay? So as aorta is exiting the heart, a small branch comes off of the aorta, and they are known as left coronary artery and right coronary artery. So left coronary and right coronary artery. So logically, left is going to supply the left side of the heart, right is going to supply the right side of the heart. So left coronary artery comes down, and right where the atrium and ventricle are joining each other, it starts to branch. So the left coronary artery branches to the one that comes right in front of the heart, right, this one, called the anterior interventricular artery, because it runs in front of the heart between the two ventricles. And the other branch literally goes around the heart. So it circles behind the heart. So it becomes the circumflex artery, like the circumflex of the circle, same concept. So circumflex artery and the anterior interventricular artery. The right coronary artery, which you guys see right here, comes to the right side of the heart and actually has many branches. These all branches are very different from one person to another. So you might have an extra blood vessel, somebody else might have two, somebody might not have any of those. So the branching of this is different on everybody's heart. However, there are one main one that you guys do need to know, which is a big one on the farther right side of the ventricle, this one right here. And this is called the right marginal artery, right marginal artery. Now, going toward the back of the heart, as you can see, kind of shaded in the back, you also have a major artery that supplies the back of the heart, and that's called the posterior interventricular artery. So you have anterior and the posterior interventricular artery. So here is basically what I have written for you guys, so you guys can have that information. Left coronary artery is going to have two branches, anterior interventricular artery and circumflex artery. Right coronary artery is going to have right marginal artery and the one that goes in the back, which is the posterior interventricular artery. You should be able to identify this on an image, guys. Be very comfortable with the image. So here is again kind of showing you this. In this image, guys, you cannot see the left coronary artery clearly because it's hidden somewhere here. What you can see right here is the branching, which is the circumflex artery right here and the anterior interventricular artery right here. Here is this big one right here, again, running in the emergence point for the right atrium and the right ventricle. That's your right coronary artery, this one right here. And then one main branch that comes off, which is shown in everybody, which is the right marginal artery. These are small ones that you can see. The smaller branches you can see here, 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 here. They're all different from one person to another. They're not going to be identical. Here is the back of the heart, and you can see the posterior interventricular artery right here, which is again the red one supplying the back of the heart. Now, I have supplied the heart with oxygenated blood. Now I'm going to collect the deoxygenated blood and return it back toward the heart. So you have what we call the coronary sinus, which is the largest blood vessel we have in the back. And that literally gets dumped into the right atrium. So coronary sinus gets dumped, all of its deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. And again, I'm going to show you guys in the picture in just a second. So here is the main veins that collect blood from your heart. You have one in the front right here. That's called the great cardiac vein. This is the one that runs right next to the anterior interventricular artery. So if I go back to the picture we had earlier, see this too, guys? The red one is the anterior interventricular, and the blue one is the great cardiac vein. So they're kind of literally parallel to each other. They run right on top of each other. One gives it blood, the other one takes away the blood. The other big one that you have is the two that are found inside, on the right-hand side of the heart. There are small branches called anterior cardiac veins. So again, it's different from one person to another. And then one that is on the side that runs parallel to the marginal artery called the small cardiac vein. There is one in the back of the heart that runs parallel to the posterior interventricular artery, and that's called the middle cardiac vein. All of these small blood vessels get dumped into the coronary sinus. So let me type a couple pieces of information for you. So anterior interventricular artery is parallel to your great cardiac vein. Your middle cardiac vein runs parallel to your posterior interventricular artery, a small cardiac vein runs parallel to your right marginal artery. So hopefully that makes it a little bit easier. So these are basically paired blood vessels, if that makes it a little bit easier for you guys to follow. And then all the veins go back to one thing. I actually have it on the slide, so I don't need to write it. So coronary sinuses collect from the great cardiac vein, middle cardiac vein, and small cardiac vein, which are the three that I just listed. Is this making sense to you guys? Is there any questions about this? Any clarification or anything? Okay. So in terms of medical conditions that can be associated with problems with the coronary arteries and veins, so basically the blood vessels that are supplying the heart, couple of imbalances that you may have. One is called angina pectoris. Angina pectoris is basically when somebody has chest pain. It doesn't mean that they have a heart attack, but basically it means that the heart muscle, your myocardium, is not receiving enough oxygen. Typically, if somebody has chest pain, it's a good indication that they are at a high risk for a heart attack. Doesn't mean that they're going to have it or they already had it. It just simply means they're at a higher risk. So the cells are going to be weakened because they're not receiving enough oxygen. And again, the person is at a higher risk of a heart attack. Now, if they do actually have a heart attack, it's called myocardial infarction or simply a heart attack. This is when one or multiple coronary arteries are blocked. And that means that the heart is not part of the heart, is not receiving enough oxygen, and therefore those cells are going to die. So when they don't receive oxygen, they're going to die. As a result, those dead cells are going to be replaced with non-contractile scar tissue. So a lot of time I ask my students, can someone with heart attack fully recover? And the answer is no, because the cells that are dead are replaced with non-contractile cells that can actively pump blood. So yes, the person may look healthy. They may be able to do a lot of the activities they did before the heart attack. However, they will never gain that fully healthy individual self, going back to that healthy individual self, because any cells that are dead, they basically come back as a scar tissue. Now, I mentioned that earlier before, but I'm just gonna go over this one more time for you guys. Which chamber of the heart, damage to what chamber of the heart is most dangerous in a heart attack? And in that case, the answer again would be your left ventricle, or sorry, I should say limited blood supply to left ventricle, because it is responsible for supplying the rest of the body with oxygenated blood. So basically, if you damage your left ventricle, the chances are that you might not recover from that. So you may actually die, versus if you have damaged the blood vessels that are supplying the right atrium or the left atrium. Now, one last thing that I want to mention is treatments for preventing or dealing with heart attack. There are two things actually. One is a surgery called the bypass surgery, when they use a blood vessel, typically from the leg, to bypass the blockage, the blocked artery, and make sure that heart is receiving, not reviving, receiving enough oxygen. That's one way. The second thing, you may have heard of it, is called angioplasty, which they use a catheter and a balloon in the blood vessel to open up the blood and open up the blockage, which is kind of cool. So it literally depends on your doctor and how severe the blockage is. So if the blockage is relatively, like I say, the blood vessel is 50% blocked, then they usually use angioplasty. But if the blockage is like 90%, they just do a bypass surgery, because it's easier for it to make sure that the circulation of the blood is taking place. Any questions? Anything needs clarification, guys? No? So a couple notes for people that may have come in late to the meeting. I'm going to stop the recording. So